Okay, welcome back to episode 2 of It's Killer. This episode we will be talking about the murder of Ruthie Mae McCoy. Now, all of this is mostly based on Steve Mahara's a Chicago Reader article from 1980. So I gathered most from this article, but I did also use a few other outside resources. So we're going to start with going over the basics again, and we'll just get into it. So the first paragraph of this article starts at 8:45 on the night of April 22nd, 1987. Chicago's 911 dispatch gets a call from a 52-year-old woman named Ruthie Mae McCoy, and she lives near the west neighborhood of Chicago in a public housing complex called Abdala. I need to be corrected if I'm saying that wrong. In the Grace Abbott Homes high-rise building apartment 1109, and she's calling to report something unbelievable that is happening in her bathroom. She's nervous, and she tells the dispatcher, quote, "Some people next door are totally tearing this down, end quote. Ruthie's sentences make it hard to understand for the dispatcher, and the dispatcher goes on to ask her if people are going to break down the wall, and she replies, yeah. They throwed the cabinet down, and I'm in the projects on the other side. They can reach through my bathroom if they want to come in." The dispatcher doesn't really know what to do, and he sends the police to respond to a, quote, disturbance with a neighbor, end quote, and police are slow responding to the 911 dispatch and get 2 more calls, one at 9:02 and another at almost 9:20 after the first 911 call from Ruthie's neighbors reporting in on this. The neighbors claim they've heard gunshots in the apartment, and so when cops arrive about 10 minutes after 9, police officers bang on Ruthie's door and announce themselves, but no one answers. One of the officers tells dispatch that they think there may be someone in there holding Ruthie captive or holding people in the apartment. The officers have dispatch call back the number Ruthie called in from, and they listen from the hallway as their phone rings, but no one ever picks up. The officers then go on to radio to others that are standing outside of the building and tells them to go down to the housing office that's almost a block away to get a spare key to Ruth's apartment. They come back with it and the key doesn't fit, so then they discuss breaking down the door, but instead decide to knock on her neighbor's door to try and gather more info. The apartment next door, 1108, is found to be vacant. The neighbors across the hall don't answer, and the neighbors down the hall don't have information except that Ruth always answers her door. One officer reportedly tells dispatch that there is no answer, so they don't know if they have the wrong person or what happened to Ruth, but there is a suspicion from 2 separate reports of gunshots being heard at 8:48, 38 minutes after trying to contact Ruth. The police eventually gave up and left the scene. This doesn't make any sense because she was calling and she said someone was trying to break in. Neighbors reported gunshots. Why would the cops leave the scene? She does live in the projects, so people have, when discussing theories, people have talked about, she lives in the projects, like this is something that happened then, and it just doesn't normally happen. So a neighbor named Deborah Lisley, who lives in the hall, sees Ruth every morning, and when she drops in by Deborah's apartment to say hi on her way out for the day, and also drops by when she comes back on her way home. But on April 23rd, Deborah doesn't get any visits from Ruthie, and she remembers that the cops were banging on her door the night before. So Deborah is very worried for her neighbor, and she calls the police to go in for a wellness check. So 6 officers, along with a few people from the Chicago Housing Authority, show up to check on Ruthie again. They knock and knock, but no one answers, and the police start talking about breaking down the door, but the Chicago Housing Authority steps in to stop them. They warn the police that they might face a lawsuit from the tenant or an unlawful break-in, and the police would not be responsible for immediately replacing a broken down door, which is likely going to be $50, which just seems not worth the trouble. So the police leave Ruthie's apartment without any real investigation for the second time, leaving neighbor Deborah to be sure that something is horribly wrong. She waits until the next day before she can get any help. She calls the project office, and at 1 o'clock on Friday, April 24th, someone from the office arrives with a carpenter who drills through the lock on Ruthie's door, and once the door opens, they find Ruthie's body on her side in her bedroom on the floor in a pool of blood. There are paper and coins scattered all around the room, and 4 bullet holes are in her body. There's one in her left shoulder, one on her left thigh, a third in her abdomen on the right side, and a fourth that is going through her upper arm. And the bullet that cut through her chest into a pulmonary vein. So it's determined that by April 24th, 4:35 p.m., she is pronounced dead from internal bleeding. With all of this being said, we can get into some background on Ruthie McCoy. She was born in Arkansas, and her family moved to Chicago's South Side, and her family works hard to stay in a reasonable area. Ruthie's dad eventually finds work loading coal for distribution around the city, but the pay isn't very good, and the family struggles even more. In Chicago, Ruthie goes to Phillips High School about a year before dropping out of 10th grade, presumably to help such a big family by working and taking care of her siblings. It's noted that in her 20s, Ruthie's behavior started to change. Relatives noticed that she talks to herself and experienced sudden fits of rage, and of course, this was a time when mental illness wasn't talked about, and it wasn't widely known and discussed as it is today. So there's a chance her family didn't know what was going on with her, and even if they didn't have the resources to get her the proper treatment. So her mental illness goes undiagnosed and untreated as she gets older. She works as a laundromat attendant and a housekeeper and holding down other odd jobs. But her declining mental health makes it tough for her to keep any jobs for a sustained period of time. Between jobs, she relies on government assistance to get by. Ruthie's mother is a devout Baptist who raised her children in the church, and Ruthie's brother, Hayward, grows up to be a preacher. He attributes all these problems to her stepping out of God. So it can be seen how her family probably wasn't the best support system for her if she did have these mental health issues, or even if she was just struggling for a period of time, because this has to weigh down on a person, constantly moving from job to job, and also just living in this situation. It wears down on someone. So her brother prays for Ruthie's health and says God can intervene, and quote, people have got to want help, unquote. More about Ruthie. She gets pregnant when she's 27, and although she never marries, at age 27, she gives birth to her only child, a daughter named Renita. So Ruthie cares for her daughter the best she can, but her untreated mental health issues make it already a difficult job being a single mother. Even tougher, Ruthie is hospitalized several times, and her daughter is placed in rotating care of relatives and friends. So the doctors prescribe her some medication, but she can't take it, and she can't afford taking it. So her problems just start all over again. So we're going to dive a little more deeper into where Ruthie ended up living. In the 1980 census, a yearly income for families in the Grace Abbott is $4,500 a year, and that only the moderate wealthy residents here are the drug dealers. There's a drug dealing gang called the Paymasters that are prominent in Grace Abbott, and they often take over empty units so they can operate anonymously. And if anyone reports them to the police, they're known by responding by pouring gas on the snitch's front door and setting it on fire. So violent crime is rampant in the area she's in. In 1986, a city of Chicago has a violent crime rate, and the whole city is 22.9 crimes per 1,000 residents. A 1978 Reader Chicago article reporter Steve Ferrara cites that the 1972 study of New York City high-rises conducted by a housing expert, Oscar Newman. And Oscar Newman goes on to say that the high-rises are the worst kind of buildings that people can use for public housing because they promote anonymity, which makes it basically for shady characters to hide. It is difficult to build a strong community in a setup like that. And a historian and architecture expert named Durava Boyle Jr. describes the Grace Abbott homes directly in his 1978 book on Chicago public housing, The Poor Housing, saying, quote, more than any project built in Chicago to that date, which was 1955, the overall feeling of the Abbott homes is forbidding and the human scale is completely lost, end quote. So, of course, Ruthie is aware of Abba's reputation. So, in May 83, in need of a new place to stay in Chicago's public housing, they try to avoid winding up in those high rises, but she writes 2 letters. The first being asked to be placed near her family in the Southside Wentworth Gardens, and the second letter asked to be placed anywhere but a high rise. But despite her efforts, Ruthie is placed in apartment 1109 in the Grace Abbott Homes high rise, and it just feels like that no one reached out to help her, even though of her claims. So it makes, also, the high rise makes basically a maze. For police to get in there, it is nearly impossible for them to get there timely, and makes it difficult to end up finding the apartment that they're looking for. As Ruthie lives in this high-rise, her mental state declines even further. She starts carrying around a stick and threatens the kids when they get out of hand. Of course, they make fun of her, and she has a reputation for being strange, obviously due to the mental illness issues, and the police respond to these incidents more than one occasion, but nothing serious ever comes of it. They know of her not as a violent person, just as someone who's argumentative. And Ruthie's paranoia about being mugged shows that it's likely she is going to become obsessed with locks. So she changed the locks on her door twice. This is why when they go down to the housing agency that was 2 blocks away in the beginning of the episode, they're not able to get in because the key doesn't fit, because she's so paranoid that she had all of the locks changed. Which is smart, but in this case led to an unfortunate situation. Diving back into the day of her murder, it seems like a normal day for her. She heads out to Mount Sinai in the morning, popping in to her neighbor Deborah's apartment. On the way out to say hi, she gets on the van that takes her to the treatment center and spends most of the day involved in her regular slate of activities. And then towards the end of the day, she discusses her housing situation with Sandy Sigel, and she tells her, I need help getting an apartment somewhere else. I got to get out of there. And basically, she can now get out because as of September 86, she applied for supplemental security income, and in February 87, she found out that she got it. So go Ruthie. She's now got her monthly income now doubles. Instead of $150 a month, she's now getting $340 a month. So when she gets the paycheck back, when she applied in September, she gets a check for almost $2,000 shares. So she plans to use most of that check for the deposit on the new apartment. But in the meantime, she uses to buy a nice winter coat to keep her warm, and then, of course, the small housing necessities that up until then she'd been forced to do without. So everything's looking up for her, and then she goes home. Obviously, the very unfortunate happens with the police report and the 911 call, and eventually her murder. So when her daughter is eventually brought back in, because at this time she's an adult, she goes back into the apartment, and aside from the small change that was found scattered on the floor, there's no money to be found anywhere. Her daughter does end up telling the police about the big check that her mother had just gotten in cash, even though she's saying that she kept cash in the apartment, that now it is gone, along with Ruthie's TV and her cane-backed rocking chair. So her daughter looks around the apartment and also notices Ruthie's phone is missing. So there are many also theories surrounding this, saying they came in, they had heard her talking about all of this money, and they came in to get it from her. And also a big theory and a big red flag is that the apartment 1108 next to her had been vacant. So it is also known that these gangs would come into these apartments and use them so they couldn't be tracked. So it's gathered that the gang went into this apartment, had heard Ruthie talking about all of this money, and then used the connecting wall to break into her bathroom, presumably through force, obviously because she reported the banging, and went in and stole all of the money from her and ended up killing Ruthie also. So, diving into theories, there's one that says the people at Mount Sinai could have been connected to this, but that is highly doubted, as the treatment center had very high reviews, and the people around Ruthie had been known to trust her because of her paranoia. Not in that way, but like Ruthie surrounded herself with a very select amount of people because of her paranoia, is what I was trying to say. She has a very like strict, I guess, standard for who she hangs out with. And that is something to be said about her, that she's not just going to let anyone random hear about this. Even though she was very proud of it, she kind of kept to herself in that way. And another theory talks about how someone could have just overheard her because those high rises were filled with any amounts of people. So, I don't know. I think that definitely the mob or gang had been using the next door apartment and had come in through the connecting wall to unfortunately get that money and end up killing Ruthie. It is unknown whether or not to kill Ruthie was the ultimate goal, but I imagine she didn't go out without a fight, so they had to end up killing her, whether or not it was the goal or not. So let me know what y'all think on this, if y'all think more on it. And this case is really interesting, so I totally recommend looking it up and coming to your own conclusions. And you can look more into the gangs also and see what else you can find. But that is all for today. Thank you for listening. And this has been episode 2 of It's Killer.